give you a little bit of background. On Wednesdays, every other Wednesday, we have a midweek together where we have a meal and there's activities for children and youth, and then the adults who aren't involved with that have a class of which I happen to be teaching. And we're using a book called Half-Truths. The author of that is Adam Hamilton, and it's a series of sayings that people think are in the Bible, think are scripture, but they're really not. And in most cases, those are partially true, but probably not totally true. And the one this week was, God helps those who help themselves. You ever heard that? Have you ever said that? Do you think that's in the Bible? If you do think it's in the Bible, you're not alone. A poll by George Barnum, researchers, found that 8 out of 10 people thought that was scripture. In fact, some people thought that was one of the 10 commandments, which it is not. And it is really not in the Bible, at least not in that form. From what we know, the first time this phrase appeared was in Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac in 1736. And it may have been a popular saying even then that goes back farther than that. But it's a popular saying, but it's not really in the Bible. It's actually a half-truth, or as Adam Hamilton, the author of this book, says, it's more like a one-third truth. Because while it's in one sense true, there are a couple of other senses in which it's really not true. And so first, I want to talk about what is true about that saying. It certainly is true that God wants us to help ourselves when we're able to do so. And God assists us in helping ourselves as well. In fact, there are a lot of scriptures that refer to work and to being a responsible person. And one of those is here in our litany from Paul's letter to the church at Thessalonica, where he says, keep away from believers who are living in idleness and not according to the traditions that they receive from us. He says, you know that when we were with you, we didn't eat any food or without paying for it. We worked to support ourselves so that we wouldn't be a burden on anyone. And we gave you the command that anybody who's unwilling to work shouldn't eat, shouldn't be given food. For we hear that some people are living in idleness. Some people aren't doing anything. They're goofing off. Now, at least part of the situation there was that in that church, and probably the other young churches of that day, people expected Jesus to return very soon. And so there were people who were saying, well, I'm just going to get ready for the coming of the kingdom. I don't need to do anything. Jesus is coming back. He's going to take care of it. We'll just sit and wait for the Lord's return. Well, the problem was other people had to be feeding them and taking care of it. And it's a good thing they didn't continue that policy, because they would still be waiting, frankly, 2,000 years later, and still mooching off of their fellow church members. And it must have been an ongoing problem, because there are other places that appears too. Actually, in 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes, aspire to live quietly, mind your own affairs, work with your hands, so that you may behave properly toward outsiders and be dependent on no one. He cautioned that church a couple of times about this. Every person, says Paul, is called to do their part and our part, to help ourselves and to be realistic about things that are our responsibility to do. In in the video that came with the book that we used Wednesday night, the author gave an example of how sometimes we might not be realistic about what is our part and what is God's part. He said someone in his church had been trying to sell their house for a long time, and it just wouldn't sell. And they were, every Sunday at church, they would ask the congregation to pray that that house will sell. And they had also taken a statue of one of the saints and buried it in their front yard beside the realtor's sign. Now, I'm not sure why they did that, he didn't say, but they were really getting pretty desperate to sell their house, and it just wasn't selling. And so Hamilton says, finally, he said, well, what's your realtor saying about this, that why your house won't sell? And they said, well, realtor says we're asking $10,000 too much for the house. And so he said, well, why don't you follow your realtor's advice and do what they're telling you? And they did. They lowered the price and the house sold quickly. And so he uses that as an example of how sometimes we're not doing our part. We're unrealistic in our expectations. We're asking God to do things for us that we should be doing for ourselves, or that we're really, in a sense, they were trying to cheat somebody, I guess, by making somebody else pay more for that house than it was worth. And when they got real and realized that, then the house sold. God provided. The point is, God will do God's part, but we also need to do our part. So it's appropriate to pray. It's appropriate to ask God for help, but we also need to help ourselves. You know, that we need to both pray and work. And I remember a saying I've heard that I kind of like. Not sure it's totally true either, but the saying is, pray as if everything depends on God, and work as if everything depends on you. You kind of do both of those. And when you do both of those, when we put a lot of emphasis on prayer and also a lot of emphasis on what we're supposed to do, good things happen. In fact, in the book, he refers to a phrase that Benedictine monks used to use. It's in Latin. I didn't take Latin, but it's ora et labora. Labora means labor or work, and that phrase means pray and work, which, good reminder, do both pray and work. And that's essentially Paul's message to this church, and Paul's message to a number of those churches. Our faith certainly is meant to move us into action, even as we trust in God. Both pray and work certainly is good advice. So in that sense, God helps those who help themselves is true. It is true. God does expect us to help ourselves. But then there are a couple of reasons why this phrase is not totally true. And the first of those is that this phrase can be used as a way of avoiding our obligation as Christians to help other people. And the fact just is that there are some people who truly need our help. And the Bible, very clearly, and especially in the teachings of Jesus, tell us that we need to help others. Now, sometimes it's not easy to determine who really needs that help and who doesn't. And Paul addresses that, I think, in one place in 1 Timothy, in his letter to Timothy, chapter 5, beginning at verse 3, he writes, honor widows who are really widows. If a widow has children or grandchildren, they should first learn their religious duty to their own family and make some repayment to their parents. for this is pleasing in God's sight. The real widow, left alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give these commands as well, so that they may be above reproach, and whoever does not provide for relatives, and especially for family members, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So, he says it's important to honor or to help widows who are really widows. And by that, he means people who have no family to help. You know, the family has obligation to help family. But a widow who doesn't have children or other close relatives, you need to focus on helping them the most. And he was trying to balance here who really needs help and who doesn't need help, or who can receive help from family members, those who have the first obligation to help. And that's good advice, and it's advice that we, I think, still practice in the church. And we acknowledge that it's not always easy to determine who really needs help and who doesn't. We spend a lot of effort sometimes trying to figure out who is worthy, you know, and perhaps sometimes we spend too much time in that. We try to rationalize that that maybe that person is undeserving, or they don't need help, or somebody else should be helping them, or whatever. And that can get frustrating sometimes in deacons' meetings and other places. I guess the conclusion I've come to in that is that I would rather be found guilty of helping somebody who doesn't deserve it than failing to help somebody who really needs it. Yeah. If there's a question mark. But it's not always easy, certainly, we acknowledge. It's not easy to determine those things. And we can look to the Bible for guidance, even back in Leviticus in the Old Testament, all of those laws and rules. Leviticus 23:22 states, when you harvest your crop, whether wheat or whatever, you shall not reap all the way to the edge of the field. Leave some for the poor and the immigrants, or the aliens, people who aren't from around here. And then it's a command from God. He says, I am the Lord, your God. Here is a command that we could say is rather creative, because it involves both compassion and charity, but it also allows for the dignity of the person being helped. Because, see, here the poor person who has no grain or no opportunity to acquire it otherwise is allowed the dignity of work, the opportunity to go and harvest the grain themselves. They're given access to the food that other people have, or the surplus around the edge of the field that they could not produce on their own. And this command recognizes God as the ultimate source of all. So the landowner, while they have the grain, ultimately God is the owner of all wealth and property. And God is saying here, it seems, all of this is mine. I command you to share it, to share that which has been entrusted to you. So how do we help in ways that remind people and remind ourselves that all of our resources belong to God? How do we help them in ways that encourage them to participate in what they receive, and that does not create dependency? Those are they're good questions to ask, not always so easy to answer. The Bible wrestles with those things. Proverbs kind of has it both ways, you could say. Proverbs 10:4. Laziness brings poverty. Hard work makes one rich. Well, We could just read that one and not go any farther, but then you go down to Proverbs 19:17. Those who are gracious to the poor lend to the Lord, and the Lord will fully repay them. Or Proverbs 22:13. Happy are generous people, for they give some of their food to the poor. Happy are they. You know, there's real joy, there's real blessing that comes with giving. And I always think how sad it is that tight-fisted people who will not share, how much they miss out on. Miss out on the joy of giving. There's just a deep satisfaction that comes with sharing with others, with giving to others. In the New Testament, Jesus had a lot to say about sharing, about having compassion, about loving others. We could spend all morning quoting those scriptures, but I just want to briefly mention Matthew 25, the parable of the great judgment, where Jesus says, when you helped one of the least of these, you helped me. And when you failed to help one of the least of these, you failed to help me. That's a very sobering statement that we need to take seriously. So, in a real sense, the biblical truth, as opposed to that half-truth, is that God helps those who can't help themselves. And God calls us to do likewise. He calls us to show compassion and mercy, because that's a part of the character of God. That's who God is. That is the way of Jesus. That is who Jesus was and is. And we find that throughout the Good Samaritan story. Jesus asked, okay, who was a neighbor to the person in need? Well, the one who helped him. Yeah, that was not too hard to figure out. Go and do likewise. Go and do it. Being a neighbor to someone in need should not be considered a burden, but rather a joy and an opportunity, because there is much satisfaction to be found in helping, and we receive a blessing when we bless others. We receive a blessing as well, and it's sad when people miss out on that. And then the second reason, or a second reason, probably there are more, that God helps those. The second reason that phrase, God helps those who help themselves, is only half true, or 1/3 true, and we should be glad that it's not totally true, is that there's some times that we can't help ourselves either. That's right. You know, we need help. There are situations, and I suspect every one of us has had some of those, and if you haven't yet, you will, when you just feel overwhelmed, when you feel helpless, when you feel you cannot get out of this pit that you're in. And in that pit can mean a lot of different things. It can be some sin, some addiction. It might be a time of depression and despair. It might be some health issue, some relationship issue. It's something in our life that we just can't fix on our own. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that there are times that we simply need help from someone beyond us, a power greater than we are. And it is precisely when we are the most helpless that God is there for us, to help us, to forgive us, to redeem us, to pull us up out of that pit. When we've made a mess of things, God's mercy, God's strength is available, and it comes to us. And that's what we call God's grace. The grace of God, unmerited grace that we don't deserve, but that God freely gives to us. So maybe that phrase should read, God helps those who can't help themselves. Not just God helps those who can help themselves. Well, in wrapping this up, it is true that there are times when we and others can and should help ourselves. Laziness or sloth certainly is not a virtue. We need to take responsibility for our lives, for our actions. Ever since the time of Adam and Eve, people have earned their living by the sweat of their brow. And when we're able, we should also. But it's not always that clear-cut, because there are some people who just struggle for a great variety of reasons, and we often don't really know their reasons. We have not walked a mile in their shoes. We don't know what their life is like. The Bible does not teach every person for themselves. It does not teach rugged individualism. The Bible is filled with stories about a compassionate God. God's compassion for us and to us, and God's call for us to be compassionate toward other people. Jesus says the law can be boiled down to 2 commandments. The whole thing. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. That's pretty much it. That's the entire Bible. That's central. That's what Jesus said. So, we cannot ignore the needs of others by saying that they just need to help themselves. And only those who help themselves will God help. It just might be that God is trying to help them, and He wants to do it through us. Did you ever think of that? God might be calling us to be His means of grace or His means of helpfulness to another person. And we should be truly thankful that God doesn't just help those who help themselves, because we also will find ourselves in those situations where we can't help ourselves either. And so when that occurs, may we remember, God helps those who can't help themselves. Amen. Amen. Now, we